Good morning. This is Eastside SDA Fellowship Sabbath School, and I am here with my wife Jody, and we have our pastor, Pastor Sam Gungaloo, and then part of this panel again is my family, which includes Lee Meadowcroft, who is married to my sister, Mark Griffin, who is my younger brother. And then I have my son here, who is a freshman at Walla Walla College, JC Griffin, representing the younger generation. And the book we're going through for this Sabbath school is Patriarchs to Prophets. This is my copy of it. And the chapter we're going through today is a pretty heavy topic, actually. It's chapter 32, starting on page 363. And it's titled The Law and the Covenants. And so after reading through this, I came up with a title for our Sabbath school, and it is 2 by 2, the 10, the 3, the 1, and a blast to the past. And that'll all make a little bit more sense once we're done discussing it.
Well, I'm gonna leave you guys to it, but before you guys get on, let me pray with you. And I look forward to the discussion. If you're online with us, we want to welcome you. Feel free to write in some questions on the YouTube or connect with us, and I'll pass those on to the panel here. So let me pray for you. Off you go, guys. Father in heaven, we want to thank you so much for being in this space. Be with this discussion, be with this panel, and allow your Holy Spirit to lead. In Jesus' name, amen. Over to you guys.
All right, so I usually like to start this Sabbath school out by getting an initial impression on the chapter. And let's start with, I don't want to put JC on the spot, but it's the younger generation. And so I'm kind of curious as to what he has to think about this chapter, and as to whether any of this was new information to him or not. And then we'll see what anyone else has to say. And then we'll break it down a bit and discuss it a little bit further in detail, I think.
I think that this chapter wasn't necessarily new information. I think it was just worded differently than I'm used to, considering that I'm at a university church right now. So it is aimed towards kids my age. And in the past, I've also been in churches which are wording the same thoughts pretty much the same, if that makes sense. It's not a lot of variation, whereas this one was an older style of the wording, but you can definitely tell that it is the same thoughts. It's just a different time period of it being written.
Good. What about other people? Your thoughts on initially reading this book? I mean, not this book, this chapter.
Seemed to me like she tried to cover a lot of stuff in 10 pages. Each one of these sections, she kind of talks about 3 or 4 different complete things, and each one of those can be a book in and of itself. So the actual chapter for me, it was hard to, I don't know, because it's going in so many different directions. It was difficult for me to sort of be very concise with it. So.
Yeah, I'll have to be honest. The first read for me, I kind of held it together for about the first 2/3, which is basically where she's covering the law, and she kind of talks about the ceremonial law. Let's call it the ceremonial law because she uses a couple different names for it, and contrasts it with the moral law. But then the last third, she gets into the covenant, and it just kind of boom. I kind of lost it, and I knew I was going to be coming back and reading it again. And so the second time around, I actually did spend a little bit more time on the covenant, and it was interesting because that very easily, like Lee said, could have been a whole book, and the first 2/3 could have been a whole book. And I mean, what was my thought afterwards was this is kind of right in the middle of the book. And a lot of the Old Testament writers, the the heart of their text they would put in the middle. They'd kind of lead up to it. The heart of it they'd put in the middle, and then they would kind of reinforce it as they went. And so Ellen White kind of did this. In a lot of ways, this is like Hebrews in the New Testament, where it's kind of trying to bridge the Old Testament and the New Testament together. I mean, there were just a lot of different angles. But sorry, Mark, go ahead and tell us what you thought, and then we'll see what Jody thought.
Well, I guess my thoughts are very close in line with what JC and Lee were also sharing. I mean, it's a tough read, and it's a lot of information at once. I found myself reading the same sentence over and over and over again, trying to connect how and what she was trying to express. But I think it's an important chapter, because I think this chapter, ultimately, it speaks certainly about the law and the covenant, but it speaks to God's relationship with us and his tenacity or his resistance to give up on us. And I guess that in many ways, that's kind of what the snapshot that I kind of started to walk away from this with was that, wow, God just never stopped trying. And I was kind of excited by that.
So it's interesting you bring that up, because my other brother, Craig, wasn't able to join us, but he'd been going through some studies, and it had to do with Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one, and kind of that Jewish prayer. And it's a breakdown of the prayer, but part of that is talking about God's love. And there's this loyal love that's called, and I can't pronounce it right, it's basically Chesed. It's Khesed. But it's a very it's a love full of grace, in that it doesn't matter what you do. God still loves you, and he's still seeking you and trying to save you and help you in your situation and bring you closer to him. And Craig had obviously read this chapter, and it had connected him to what he'd been studying separately, ironically enough. And the second read through, it was interesting, because that's very much the case here. Jody, any thoughts?
Not a whole lot different than the others. It is pretty heavy, and again, you have to reread. I think, like Mark said, you have to go back, reread, and like, what was that, and keep looping around. There was one little section that when I read through it the first time, it was easier to read, but then it reminded me of the events of this week, and politically, where it was talking about God called Abraham, he prospered and honored him. And it was his fidelity was a light to the people of the countries around him. He maintained friendly relations with the kings of the surrounding nations, and some of them he was treated with great respect, and his integrity and selfishness, his valor and benevolence were representing the character of God. So I was like, it kind of led me back to some political things, just looking at, reminding me of the inauguration and our relations with other countries and whatnot. That was about the easiest part of the read for the whole chapter right there. The rest of them I had to go back and what, but I did that little section did remind me of some political things we saw this week.
Yeah, just to put things in context, this is the week where there was a transition of power in America from the Trump administration to the inauguration, and Biden now starting his own administration. And it is interesting that you bring that up, because it's hard not to think politically. And I want to loop back to what you said in just a minute, because that kind of gets to the how the law and the covenant's important, I think. But I want to define a couple things real quick, because I think this chapter gets a lot easier if you realize that there's two parts to the law that Ellen White's talking about. And then there's also two parts to the covenant that she's talking about. And if you don't keep those two parts clear in your mind, it can get pretty confusing pretty quickly. And so just to summarize it real quickly, and then I want to open it up to discussion by starting to talk about the law, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the covenant. But then I want to get to what Jody's saying and how that was practical and how God was able to witness to others in the Old Testament was how we witness to others now. And the 2x2 in the chapter has to do with these two parts of the law and two parts of the covenant. Just the law, there's two parts of the law. One is the moral law, which is basically the 10 Commandments and the things attached to the 10 Commandments of the Father, I guess you could say. It's above and beyond just this world and everything that's been created in this world. It's part of the universe that God has created and God is a ruler over. And then there is more of the ceremonial law, which is also happened at the time of Mount Sinai, and that's what made it a little bit confusing, but has to do with what Ellen White calls types and antitypes, which I also want to clarify because that can be a little confusing. And what she talks about is the type would be like the sacrifice of the lamb on the altar is a symbol that looks forward to Jesus coming and being the ultimate sacrifice, which she calls the antitype, which I think we need to keep clear as well. So there's the moral law and then the ceremonial law. Let's talk about that a little bit right now. And then I want to talk about the covenant. And then I also want to talk about what's the difference between the law and the covenant. Any thoughts? Sorry, I don't want to be talking too much.
Well,
and Lee's a lawyer, by the way. Mark, you should talk first and then let Lee talk.
I plead the fifth right off the bat. So I think that what I walked away from, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you can correct me on this, but what I walked away from is that the moral law always existed. And that was part of God's original plan prior to sin entering the world, Adam and Eve falling, the tree, the apple. Whereas the ceremonial law was kind of an after, you might call it plan two, where after sin entered and redemption was now needed and Christ was now needed to die. And so this was a training period for us, for civilization, for the world. And I guess the two of those elements, that's kind of how, in my mind, I see them or how I understand them. I don't know if that resonates with anybody else or if that's even accurate, but that's kind of how I see it, which made a little bit more sense for me.
All right.
Is that legal, Lee?
JC.
Sure.
So before we get to Lee.
Did we have something to say?
Well, he was going to talk when Mark spoke up. Ellen White basically says that a lot of this ceremonial law was specifically set up for the Israelites coming out of Egypt and how they had lost what was originally, the moral law. Mm-hmm. It had become polluted by the Egyptians and all their gods and the paganism that surrounded, their lifestyle basically. And that everything that happened on Mount Sinai, God had to kind of spell out. And in a lot of ways, there's a remediation to put them back on firm standing as to what God expected. So it's interesting. And that is what supposedly went away and did. I don't have any reason to believe it didn't when Jesus died on the cross, but the moral law, like Mark was talking about, continued. Are there laws now that are similar to the Levitical laws that we stand by? Or is everything gone and we just need to stand by the 10 Commandments? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I think that's the ultimate question, right? I mean, every time I read this, like you, 2 or 3 times, and that to me the way Ellen White presents this is very much like, well, it's clear. Well, after my third read, I'm like, what? This isn't as clear as she thinks it is. I won't take a lot of time, and I don't want to be the heretic in the room. And I always tend to be that. Maybe it's because I am a lawyer, but there's a concept in law even now about the spirit of the law, and you can make that as an argument. Now, mind you, if you walk into court and your whole argument is based on, well, the spirit of the law, you're in a lot of hurt, and you're not going to go very far. But that is an actual concept. I mean, there are certain laws that what's the spirit behind this, and you can argue that. And I think that, to me, that was what I kept thinking about with the distinction between the moral law and the other ceremonial law. But then when it's very easy to say, well, the sacrificial laws, those all went away. But there's other things tied in. It's not just, oh, you have to sacrifice a dove for this or that. There's a lot more there. And what I think we need to do as a church and as a community of Christians is sort of fight against the picking and choosing of, well, this one, yeah, we're going to follow this law. It's not necessarily in the 10 Commandments, but we're not going to follow this one because obviously that one went away. And that, I think there's a danger there that we allow ourselves to sort of pick and choose some of these, I'm not going to say laws, but I mean, we sort of pick and choose the direction that we think that is right or not right. Where I always fall back to the spirit of the law, which is what's behind the 10 Commandments, right? I mean,
Right.
that what Mark was saying, I think, is true. I mean, there was always this moral law that applies, and it applies to us, and it applies to people that never will ever hear of Christ and live on this earth and die, right? There is something that applies to those people as well as those of us who have read the Bible numerous times.
So I found it. I also agree with you, Lee. I mean, you get more clarity when you read it, but then the more you think about it and the more you read it, sometimes you can get lost in the weeds, and it becomes clear. I mean, the moral law with the 10 Commandments is pretty solid, and it covers a lot of stuff. But the ceremonial law can almost be divided into what happened with the sanctuary service, which obviously pointed to Christ. But then there was a lot of these laws that were just camp rules where you have 2 to 3 million people living and things just needed to be ordered. And so then that's probably the part that I kind of see as, changes with times. And I mean, I think in a lot of ways we have those same rules, which is just rules of society that protect us. You stop at a stop sign, you follow the speed limit. JC, are those important?
He says JC, I say John. Come on, man.
I think that in the context of what Lee is saying, the spirit of the law, are the laws we live in within society important to follow, or are there times when we don't need to follow?
Well, for the most part, to make society work, just like then, yeah, you do need those laws for not complete chaos and people to stay safe. But it's interesting going back to what Lee said. Sometimes we do pick and choose, and we can look at the history of our church and issues that we've chosen to take issue with, I guess. And then now we look back, however many years later, and it's like, well, was that important, or did we miss the mark on that? And sometimes I wonder, if we'll look back, things that are important right now, if we'll look back and say that we missed the mark once again.
I like that because it keeps things in context. And I think our context now compared to children of Israel living in the desert are two different things. Now, I mean, we could end up in a desert where those laws become very relevant all of a sudden. but we aren't in a desert right now.
It keeps us humble as well, John. I think, I love what Ellen White when she says present truth, because that to me means that the truth is moving. It's a moving target. And what people are with the people of Israel, those who left Egypt, what their truth and what their light was is completely different than ours. And I think, 100 years from now, 1,000 years, if Christ isn't back, I think the present truth is going to be different. We're going to look at things in a completely different way. And so I personally like that, because I grew up with black and white, and as I'm getting older,
It's a lot of gray.
finding the gray is a better place for me, not just in my hair.
Yeah, I know. It's hard not to think of that.
And John, I should be considered in the younger generation because I'm a full 6 months younger than you. So
I think Mark's 5 years younger than me.
Yeah.
So me and Jody represent the older generation.
Lee's
Well,
older.
I'm older than Jody, so
Yeah.
don't lump her into that.
All right. So I want to take the next step. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Well, I was going to add one more thing to that, and that is that the moral law never changes, and it's the ceremonial law that we keep wrestling with, like Jody was saying. And I don't want to jump all the way to the punchline at the end of the chapter, in a sense, right quite yet, but the reality is that I believe what Christ was trying to do in giving us the law and guiding us, like you were saying, John, with the Israelites in the desert, there was some practical guidelines that needed to happen to just function. And that's because I think that they, as slaves, lost a lot of that. And over the course of civilization, we lost a lot of that. I think Adam and Eve had it to start with. And so God had to do a lot of retraining in that process. But the ultimate point was relationship, and how we relate with God and how we relate with one another. And I think that that's ultimately the part of the ceremonial law that connects us back to that moral law, and that part doesn't change. And Jody, whether women wear hats or are allowed to speak in church or things along those lines, I think that those things, they may have been functional at one point in time, but I don't think that's really coming back to the relationship part of it. And so I think that that would be probably some of the criteria I would choose to say, well, that's not part of the law any longer.
And yet we do spend a lot of time with tradition, culture, and tradition.
Absolutely.
Which I think it has some value because it points to our past. And we're going to talk about that. The last part of the title was a blast to the past. So I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. So we've talked about law. I think we all agree the 10 Commandments are pretty solid. It's interesting that the 10 Commandments are pretty solid, but I think they cover a lot more territory than we realize. And the interesting thing with the 10 Commandments is they don't point, and correct me if I'm wrong, they don't point towards Christ and his sacrifice as much as the ceremonial law did. And I think that was the value in the ceremonial law. But now that we have Christ and his death on the cross, we continue to move ahead with the 10 Commandments. But you look at the next part of this chapter, and it's roughly the last third. It starts on page 370, if you have your books in front of you. And this is where Ellen White starts talking about the covenant. So JC, when I say covenant, we've talked about law. When I say covenant, what comes to mind? I mean, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's just in your head, if you're thinking of a covenant, and I honestly have a problem with the word, and that's part of the reason I'm wanting to start with you. What comes to mind when I say covenant? I mean, when was the last time you used the word covenant?
Personally, never, but the first thing that does come to mind, and this is through various different views of the word through different Bible classes, different pastors, all of that. The first thought that comes to my head is promise.
Good.
which is then immediately followed by like the weird tradition of cutting animals in half and walking through them, which is mentioned somewhere. I couldn't tell you where.
Abraham
Mhm.
and God renewing their covenant actually
Mhm.
with each other.
But yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is the promise. But then the second thing is definitely just like how weird it kind of was to make a covenant.
All right. So
Would you call it the same thing as a contract then?
It is a contract term.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is.
So then why don't we just call it a contract? I mean, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, but we use a lot of words in religion that just don't make any sense. And I'm kind of with JC. Outside of a religious context, I've never used the word covenant. But anyone that's business oriented, and JC's a business major, he's going to hear all kinds of stuff about contracts and law. And I mean, there's whole areas in the legal field that's just contract law specifically.
So a contract is something that could be broken by one party and the whole system fails. Is that true with the covenant as well? I guess my question was too hard for Lee.
I think he's going to find some ammo is what he's doing.
I'm guessing there's books in another
I was
room.
like, there's books somewhere out there, you know.
He came back with a book. So Mark had a question for you and he thought it was too hard and you left.
Well, I was gonna tell you what a covenant actually is, and then I realized I should probably look it up to see what Black's law has to say, which is kind of like the authority.
Well, because a contract can be broken by one party or the other. I wonder if one of the differences between a covenant and a contract is the fact that one of the entities is going to fulfill it regardless of the other entity. But I don't know. Maybe that's wrong.
That is interesting. I think you might be hitting on something. And honestly, this is the first time I've really thought of it that way. I'm curious as to what Lee comes up with in his dictionary.
Well, the problem with my dictionary is that covenant is not one of these terms where you just have covenant. It's like 4 pages of definition, but the very quick, like, here's the first bit. This is what covenant means: is an agreement, a convention, or a promise of 2 or more parties by deed in writing, signed, delivered, by which either of the parties pledges himself to the other that something is either done or shall not be done. And that, I mean, there's, as you can see, you know, there's 4 pages of this stuff, so it goes into the weeds, but that's really it. I mean, a covenant is a part of a contract, and you can violate just one covenant of a contract. It doesn't necessarily make the whole thing void, although it can. So
that's true.
So it's interesting. I mean, I totally agree with JC that a covenant is a promise. I like, and that I like because a promise should be as good. And again, this is getting back to culture and tradition, as a handshake between 2 people. But in today's world, that's not good enough. And so we go to a contract and we get lawyers involved to get it all on paper. The other word that came to mind for me, you know, just thinking about what does this word mean and how do we use it in modern times without realizing it, and we use other words for it, is vows between 2 people getting married. And it's very much the same thing. I mean, it's a promise, first and foremost, but it's also, at least in this country, becomes a contract where there is actually a piece of paper that, you know, confirms that or ratifies that, which is an interesting word we'll be coming up with here shortly. But I like what Mark says, and I'd like to think that maybe there is a word that is more specific to a covenant that can only be broken on one side and never gets broken on the other side. And this almost gets back to that word loyal love, chesed, that we use with God coming after us, whether we're doing good or whether we're doing bad, that not changing at all, but his side of the contract always being valid, whereas our side of the contract only being as valid as we make it. And you certainly see this with the children of Israel. I mean, for 40 years in the desert, they're constantly, agreeing, yes, we will do this. And in fact, God comes to give them the law. And one of the first things they say is, yes, we will do this. And then, 40 days later, Moses comes down with the law, and they've already turned their back on that covenant, and they're, basically worshiping this golden calf and back to, all the pagan rites that go around it. So any thoughts on that? And does that continue today, I guess?
The one thing I like about the word covenant is it's often it's a conditioned performance, or a condition, it's something that you have to do based on somebody else. So the way that the dictionary says it is that covenants can be dependent where performance by one party is conditioned on performance by the other. So it's back to what Mark was talking about in the relationship of God and us and his law. I love, that's why I like that term, is because it often is dependent on somebody else's action. So the way I see the old covenant is God saying, yeah, you're my people and I'm going to save you, but you have to do these things. It's conditioned on you doing this, following this, which clearly we can't do.
Well, so this is interesting because Lee all of a sudden used a word an adjective for the word covenant, the old covenant. And Ellen White spends some time, and this is honestly where it got a little confusing for me. There's an old covenant and there's a new covenant. And it took me, 2 reads, obviously, I already mentioned that, but it took doing a lot of what other people have done, and that's rereading sentences to try to keep this clear in my head. And so this is the other part of the 2x2 is there was the law with 2 parts, and there is also the covenant with 2 parts. And make sure that I stay straight on this, because it does get a little confusing. And I actually wrote it down. That's why I got this little piece of paper in front of me. And it starts on page 370, actually. But the first, well, and that's what was confusing. Ellen White starts by talking about the second covenant, which she also calls the new covenant, which is the covenant that is conditional on our obedience, but it also is what pardons us and is ratified by Christ's death and gives us this hope of eternal life. It's basically, grace, a covenant based on grace that leads to our salvation. So that's the new covenant, which is the second covenant. But she also loops back and basically implies, and I want to talk about this a little bit separately, that Abraham followed this covenant. But then it wasn't until Abraham's grandson, Jacob, his children, the 12, and himself went to Egypt, eventually after 400 years, with the influence of the Egyptians and their pagan lifestyle and the many gods they worshiped. There was a forgetfulness of this Abrahamic covenant. And so when God led the children of Israel out of Egypt with Moses on Mount Sinai, he not only, wrote down the moral law that we just got done talking about, which was the 10 Commandments, but he set up this reinforced this old covenant, where he literally told them, you can obey this and live, and you will have many blessings, or you won't. And in a lot of ways, this is what Israel struggled with. They immediately said, yes, we'll do this, but then they kept falling away and falling away. I mean, you read through the first 5 books of the Bible, and there's this constant pattern of God coming to them, lifting them up, moving them forward, and then them turning their backs and going to their old ways. And I think we do that to some degree as well. Did I say that right, or did I confuse everyone by saying that?
The thing, you use the word implied, and I swear I will now throw the dictionary away, but there is another legal concept which really, in my mind, is very, it applies to this chapter a lot, is a covenant can be an express or an implied covenant. I mean, those are actual legal terms. So you can have an express, and that's my way of looking at the old covenant versus the new covenant. Is the old covenant was very much an expressed covenant. Here are these rules.
And it was written down, and that's what we have in Leviticus. Exactly. And where
the subtle change in my mind is you still have a covenant, but now it's an implied covenant. He's written this law on our hearts. It's inside. There's an implication that's not expressed, but it's still there. And again, that's a true legal distinction. You can imply covenants in a contract that aren't necessarily written down. And I think that's a great way of looking at this new covenant that God has set with his people and with us. So anyway, I'm not throwing this out.
And I think it was important and necessary. And again, it is God trying his best, working with Israel where they were at the time. And that's why you did get into some of the nitty gritty of exactly how things needed to be done, because it had all been forgotten, and he needed to kind of start over again. I mean, it was literally a remediation, a starting over is what I mean by remediation, is what was in this covenant. And so I don't want to belabor that. Well, no, I want people's thoughts on that.
I like the remediation concept of it. I think that in my mind, what I see Christ doing through the Old Testament is starting over and over again. And I guess what it kind of looks like to me is it looks like somebody who's trying to teach somebody else mathematics. And you start where they should be, and you start discussing it, and then you discover, whoa, no, they don't even understand the foundation. And so you back up, and maybe you have to back up even further, and then you back up even further. And it feels like at Sinai, God was going to the very beginning and starting about addition, kind of a concept, and then building from there. That's what I feel like I see happening throughout the Old Testament, all the way up basically to the point where Christ is walking on this earth, is just kind of a remediation, coming back around and let's try this again.
I seem to have short memories.
Yes, as we do.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah.
I've spent.
Go ahead.
I've spent so much of my life growing up thinking, why are these Israelites such absolute morons? And they have, the parting of the Red Sea, and literally days later, they're sitting there griping and wanting to go back to Egypt because of the water situation. And I sit there and say, why on earth? And yet I have found that even in times where God has done something for me, it doesn't take long at all for me to be in a state of panic, for me to be in a state of discouragement, saying, where are you, God? How come you're never helping me out? And it wasn't just days ago or weeks ago that he actually did do something in my life. And so the Israelites may have been morons, but maybe I am too because of that. And so that's a statement on God's patience there as well, as far as I'm concerned.
So this might be an unplanned tangent to some degree. But we're talking about God, we're talking about Israel, we're talking about the Israelites, and we're talking about morons. And I think often, and I was going to say in Adventism, but let's just open up. In Christianity, often we spend so much time, and it's not a bad thing, with our focus on ourselves, unfortunately. And I think that's the problem, because we need to spend our focus on God, and specifically Jesus, because he's the example God gave us here on earth as to how to follow the law and the covenant, honestly. But we forget that there's another element, and there's an element of evil that is very much alive and well. And it's these forces of Satan himself, and the angels that work with him, that they aren't just coming and going here and there. They're here all the time, and they're doing everything they can. I think when our focus is on Jesus and doing what he is telling us to do, we very much are in a safe place. But as soon as we let our focus get away, and I think that happens sometimes, we're in distress and we reach out and we get pulled out of that distress and we're on safer ground. All of a sudden we relax our defenses a bit, and our defenses are keeping our eyes on Jesus. And then all of a sudden Satan has an opportunity to come in and knock us down, which is what he wants more than anything. And then human nature is, I did it again, and then you knock yourself down, and there's nothing Satan likes more. So I don't know how much of that, we blame Israel and we call them morons. But in a lot of ways, we're in the same camp, maybe in the same desert even, and don't realize it sometimes. Sorry, that was a tangent.
Okay.
So the 2 by 2, and then the 10 is the 10 commandments. This is going back to the title. Lee mentioned it. Something written on your heart is something you can just live by. And I remember a book that had a profound influence on me, partly when I was in Loma Linda in medical school. We went to Azure Hills Church while Morris Venden was there, and he very much clarified a lot of this for me and helped me a lot, just in his speaking, and it got me into some of his books. But one book in particular was titled Love God and Do What You Want. And don't hold me to the title, that's roughly what it was.
Do as you please, man. It's close, whatever it is.
But the idea was that if you flip everything over, so instead of just trying to follow the law to a T, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, you look towards Jesus and his love for you and what he's done, saving us from our sin, that we reciprocate that, I think is a good word, by loving others and doing the same thing for others, having some grace. And once you start doing that, you change your focus, and your focus is no longer on dotting the I's and crossing the T's, because you just automatically do that.
And
Is that possible?
I think not only is it possible, I think it's mandatory, because even within the 10 commandments, so I read those again too. And it's so, and I'll just pick as an example, let's talk about the Sabbath, right? Observe the Sabbath, you have 6 days to work, 7th day, you're not supposed to be working. Well, as a physician, you work on Sabbath. My wife, who I know, runs a residential care facility. There are many times where on Sabbath, she's going to have to do something and work. And I could say, well, I don't work on Sabbath, so therefore I'm a better Christian. I'm following the 10 commandments. Well, you can see how ludicrous that last statement is, right? And so I think what you said, John, is so accurate, because we have to not only, if you're just following the letter of the law, and I think we fall into that. It's like, well, I did this, so I'm crossing my T's.
I kept the
Back
Sabbath.
to what I said at the very beginning is this: what's the spirit of that? Is that, oh, John, you can't go to work because you get paid, but you're there saving somebody, or you're healing? That's not the spirit behind why that was written. And you can kind of do that with all of the commandments. And so I think it's very important.
I think the spirit versus the dotted I's and crossed T's is exactly what the New Testament is about.
Yeah.
I think that is the demonstration. The Pharisees are the grammar Nazis, and Christ is the one that is coming in there with a bigger picture, and his picture is about relationship. It's about the love that he has in his heart. And I don't know, I don't feel like I said that very well, but I think that is exactly what the message is in the New Testament, which is different than the Old Testament.
So I want you to hold that thought, because the title 2 by 2, the 10, the 3, the 1, and a blast of the past, the 3 that I use in the title is actually from Deuteronomy 6, Old Testament. And it says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy might." And so I'm not saying you're wrong. I think that the embodiment of that did come with Jesus, and we saw it in the flesh, and we have record of that in the Gospels specifically. But Jesus wasn't the only one that embodied that. He embodied it perfectly. And Ellen White talks about these people, and this is getting back to what Jody said with, I think it was Abraham you mentioned, and his interactions with people. And so I want to just touch on what Old Testament people, Ellen White talks about Adam to some degree, Abraham, Moses, interestingly, and then mentions Noah and Enoch. This is on page 370, the rest of this, it's the second to last sentence in that very first paragraph that's just finishing up. And he says, this is just what Enoch and Noah, Abraham, Joseph, and Moses did. So she mentioned Moses as well. So I want to just touch, and I don't want to spend too much time because we only have about 10 minutes left. Because I think ultimately we need to be able to figure out how we can do this. But looking at the Old Testament, how did these people show us how they love God with their heart and their soul and their mind? Basically, a way of saying their whole lives. And they did it imperfectly. I mean, Abraham lied twice about his wife being his sister for very, I don't know, superficial reasons. She was beautiful and she'll get taken away from me. I'm sure he loved her and stuff. But at the same time, he was a person that we call the father of faith. But at the same time, God had to keep coming back to him and renewing the covenant, because he fell out of that faith and had his firstborn with his wife's servant, and that was ultimately Ishmael before Isaac came along. So just some ideas as to how these people did it. Adam, Enoch, Abraham, well, Noah, then Abraham, then Joseph.
It seems to me that those examples that Ellen White uses, if you contemplate each of their stories, and there's so much more that is not listed in the Bible, I'm sure, but I think of Abraham, I think of Moses, and these are individuals that kind of took matters into their own hands at times. And then I think of Noah and Enoch, and these are individuals that, from what I read in the Bible, they followed the plan.
Joseph.
And yeah, well, and Joseph, I would even suggest, yes, he followed the plan, but he had counterattacks throughout his growing up, you might say. Situations that he was thrown into that were not ideal, that were not part of his plan anyhow. And so it kind of makes me feel like there's almost 3 different areas there. Those that fall off the wagon, those get pushed off the wagon, and those that stayed on the wagon. And I don't know.
And then those who got back on the wagon.
Sure.
If we're going to use the wagon analogy.
But yet they're all used. They're all part of the same story. And it's not like, I don't know. I mean, Abraham was very blessed by his 2 little lies about his wife. He ended up very profitable at the end of both of those, which has always made me scratch my head. But
true. It's interesting you mentioned when people took things into their own hands, they got into trouble. And you mentioned Abraham. I mean, ultimately, Moses very much did that. You can't help but wonder if he would have just stayed the course, how God would have used him to deliver Israel. Because he was during that time period when Israel was going to be delivered, and presumably he was either going to be part of it or not part of it. And, he ended up, killing an Egyptian and going to exile for 40 years before he came back to do it.
Yeah.
So from that list of people, for me personally, the one that caught my eye the most was Noah, because the rest have their own section and their own right being listed there. But Noah caught my eye because he didn't necessarily have the same background that the others did, because it was just from the situation that he was in, the world was corrupt, and it was kind of just Noah and his family that were God's people. And the question can be brought up, were they necessarily knowing that they were God's people, or were they just genuinely good people that were following God's law and didn't even realize it at times? Because Abraham and Moses, they had a knowledge of the law, even if it was a couple of generations past or just straight from God. But Noah was just surrounded by corruption and was still a good person. So that's why he caught my eye out of that list more so than the others.
So do you think there are good people today that are the same way? They're just good people that without knowing it are doing what God wants them to do, but have no knowledge of God and or of Jesus and everything we're talking about.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Are you asking JC?
I was asking JC, but
Oh, sorry. Go JC.
There's no way that there aren't, is the thing, because there's definitely a large number of people that say that they aren't Christian, but there's definitely still a large number of people that are genuinely good people who still follow the same general guidelines that we follow as Christians, just as their own thing.
And I think ultimately that gets counted to them as righteousness. I think the one difference, and part of the reason these people are in the Bible and these other people aren't, is because, is that God came to them and asked them to do something, and they ultimately did it. And Noah's a good example. God came to him and said, "Hey, I want you to build a boat." And this was in a society that had never seen rain, let alone large bodies of water, presumably, let alone boats that were on these large bodies of water. And he obeyed God through thick and thin. And you can only imagine, if someone did something today that no one had ever heard of, it would become a very public thing, and there would be plenty of people with opinions, and honestly, opinions about you and your relationship with God, if you were following God and saying that you were, which Noah was doing. He was trying to save other people and ultimately wasn't able to. But I think all of these people that Ellen White mentions, ultimately followed God and what he asked them to do. So we got 5 minutes left. I want to wrap in the one, because we talked about the 10 being the 10 commandments and the moral law that is still alive and well today and should direct us. We talked about the 3, which is having God in your heart, in your soul, and in your might. But then the last one is, again, and this is all from the conclusion on page 373, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And that's what I mentioned as the one. And I think the best example of that in a lot of ways is Jesus's story about the Good Samaritan, where all along, part of what Israel was supposed to be doing after their remediation was reaching out to other nations and bringing them to God. In a lot of ways, they failed. They kept going to other nations to worship their gods and to be like them, instead of staying like God wanted them to be and letting other nations be drawn to them. And there were 2 parts to this that I thought were interesting. And God very much wrapped in the blessing, with monetary wealth. And I think in a lot of ways, this is where we get the idea that if you follow God, you'll get blessed. But I think part of God's plan at the time was to monetarily improve the Israelites as part of their obedience. It was conditional on it as part of their obedience to make them more attracted to other nations. And other nations would obviously be drawn to them for monetary reasons, but then ultimately find out that it had more to do than that. It was with obedience to God and following God with your heart and your soul and your might. Thoughts on that?
I like that you said that, because I'd never thought of it that way, but ancient people were very, I mean, people think that we're very materialistic and we're very, selfish oriented, and that ancient people had, I mean, make us look like, a bunch of Mother Teresas. I mean, that was kind of their whole life was, I want to be like that person because he's got, security and food and security. I mean, so wealth and that kind of thing was hugely important to ancient people. So John, I've never actually thought of it that way, but if you put it in that context, because when I read it now, it just feels so cheap to me. It's like, oh, if I follow these things, I'm going to be materially blessed. And I kind of rebel against that. But boy, back then, that would bring people to the Lord. Like, look at these guys. They're successful. Look at all this gold that I mean, that would be hugely attractive to an ancient civilization. So that's a good point.
And you see it, probably a really good example is with Solomon and the Queen of Sheba coming to Solomon, and then ultimately bringing wealth and exchanging wealth, but then ultimately finding out that he's the wisest man in the world. And I can only hope, and I don't have any good evidence for it, but that he included, what Israel was about and what their God was about. And then hopefully the Queen of Sheba could go back with that. So in the spirit of wrapping things up, the blast to the past in the next minute is the knowledge that we now have because we have the Gospels. We know that Jesus came to represent God, and he showed us that love could supersede all of this. And if we love like he loves and keep our focus on him, all of this other stuff, the laws and the covenants would follow. But I like the way Ellen White basically says, we don't have to give up the past. We don't have to give up the Old Testament with this new knowledge. But with this new knowledge, we can have a better appreciation of the law, both the ritual and the moral law. The ceremonial is what I mean by ritual, the ceremonial and the moral law, as well as the old covenant and the new covenant. All has a different perspective, and we can have a better appreciation of it and still use the past, our knowledge now, which is the future. We can build on have a better appreciation of the knowledge from the past and build on our knowledge in the present and hopefully going into the future. We don't have enough time to discuss that much, but the thought that hit me was that the Sabbath in particular is one that people that keep Sunday often say, well, that was changed. And we say, well, it's part of the 10 Commandments. And then they tell you, well, that was nailed to the cross and it all went away with the ceremonial law. And I think with that being part of the moral law, it's reinforced. But I think even more so, having a better appreciation of the ceremonial law gives us a better standing, combining with the moral and the ceremonial law, and a better appreciation, like Lee said. If the Sabbath is looking to God and celebrating his creation, if we love God, we'll want to do that every day, but to have a special day and be able to take that apart from the rest of our work isn't a bad idea and can help us to grow in our relationship with God. So I think Sam is usually the one that wraps this up, but I think we're going to come to a close, and we will close with a prayer here. So let's bow our heads. I appreciate everyone participating in the panel. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did. And if you have questions, like Sam said, post them on the YouTube channel, and then we'll try to answer them as we go on. Let's bow our heads. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your Sabbath, a chance to reflect on you. And we did get into some difficult topics, the law and the covenant. And we do see you working in the past, as well as sending your son and preparing us for the future. And we live in the present. Let us keep your heart, your law in our hearts and your minds and in our day-to-day activities, and have it written in our hearts so that we don't have to worry about dotting the I's and crossing the T's, but can reach out to others and bring them closer to you and continue to build our relationship with you as well. Bless us this day and help us to have a good rest of the Sabbath and a good week ahead. Amen.